Hey, welcome everybody to this episode of Grow Sessions, sponsored by TSRgrow. Today, I'm really happy to be joined by Josh Turner with Yellowhammer Genetics. And Josh, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you today. How's everything going?
Going well, Mark. Thanks for having me, and thanks for TSRgrow for putting this on.
I was really it was kind of neat because we talked before. I got to know you a little bit previously. I was looking at your background and all that, and one of the things that I think is really interesting about you is that you grew up in farming, right?
I did, yeah. I grew up in Northeast Alabama on a kind of what was really unique there at the time was my granddad was big into organic farming and biodynamic farming, and so I learned a lot about, kind of things that later on became a bit more popular, like Korean natural farming and JDAM and things like that. I was, seeing those practices take place. And for a long time, I thought that was, just kind of how everybody farmed. Then when I was in high school, I went to work during the summers at a greenhouse that was close by. And I quickly learned the horticultural, more traditional agricultural scene was not the norm, and so, but yeah, I grew up, working on a farm around livestock and agriculture, and we had greenhouses and gardens, and it was a lot of fun. A lot of those things have helped me along the way for sure.
Yeah. How does so I don't really know what it means. I've heard the term Korean natural farming.
Right.
What is that exactly? I've actually heard of it recently. I have a friend in New York who has a license up there, and they have an outdoor farm that they're running, cannabis farm that they're running, and that was how they were gonna do it. The grower that they brought in, that's what they wanted to do. What is that?
So Korean natural farming is a method of farming where essentially it's a regenerative type of farming where you are taking inputs from what otherwise might be waste streams, or let's say one of the things that's more popular is making what they call fermented plant juice. And you simply take the vigorous growing shoots off of plants, which are full of vitamins and natural plant hormones and other things that plants need, especially if you can get them from the plants that you are going to be growing, because they contain the exact amount of all of the different nutrients that the plant needs that you're going to be growing. And you basically create a ferment from that. So with cannabis, what we would do is we would take, when we would take our toppings, or we would de-leaf, big leaves and things like that, we take, gather up 3, 4, 5 pounds of this vegetative material that is healthy, disease-free, pest-free, and we'll cut it up into smaller pieces to increase surface area. You combine that with some sugar, and then you compact that over a certain amount of time for the fermentation to occur. And then you've got yourself a fertilizer that can be foliar sprayed, put through irrigation. It's very rich in microbials. It's rich in all the nutrients and hormones that the plants need. And the FPJ is just one example. You can do that with fruit juice. You can make fermented fruit juice as well. Calcium, all of the major inputs that you need for farming, you can make yourself, and it's a sustainable, very cost-effective way at making fertilizers instead of purchasing like off the shelf, bottles and stuff.
So when you went from learning these things and seeing these things on the family farm and thinking well, this is just how people operate, to then being exposed to more of a commercial porty ag type of world, and you said, okay, well, maybe this isn't how people operate. I mean, overall, and you've been doing this a while, why do you think that something like Korean natural farming, or even in the world that I've been living in for the last 16 years, like aeroponics, these different methodologies that do offer advantages, that do offer something unique, or maybe even, superior plant growth in some respects, right? Why don't they scale? If that would scale, like everyone would be doing it, right?
You know, that's a great question about why don't they scale. But I have seen places where they do scale. So I'm not, and aeroponics is a great example, and something else I don't see a lot of in cannabis, or just in farming in general. But you do a little bit with greens, but like NFT systems, nutrient film technique. I think a lot of it is, and I remember having a conversation with the first greenhouse that I went to work with is a place called Aquatic Willow Growers, and they were very, they were Peters 2020 all the way. Everything was that, and I was like, this is to me was strange. I'm just like, what's going on? And I remember talking to the owner, and I was like, why don't you guys take all this plant material you're throwing away, which is perfectly healthy, and just make fertilizer yourself? It's a fraction of the cost. And he was just like, well, I remember the look on his face. He was just like puzzled, like, well, why, what? So I think a lot of it has to do with just education, or, a lot of growers like to stick with what they know works. It's about risk and reward. Is there space for, and especially in the cannabis space, it's like, do we have enough space to R&D something that we might could scale, or maybe we can't. We don't know. We got to do the R&D, but like scalability is an issue, especially with regenerative growth or regenerative methods. And I think most of it comes down to just familiarity with the technique and the process and the risk reward for outcomes. In high value crops, if you try to scale something that doesn't work, it can be devastating. Right. Yeah. So switching over from, I've seen a lot of growers really struggle with the transition from, say, rock wool to living soil. It's a big transition. There's a lot to learn, and there's huge risk. There's huge reward. But if the transition doesn't go very well, it can be detrimental to the bottom line at the end of the day. And so I think a lot of it just has to do with that, the risk reward, and what, it's, what do you grow kind of what you know. If it's a style that you've learned and that works, people kind of tend to stick with that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that we don't necessarily do a really good job of setting people up to fail successfully. And so there's this, they won't risk something new, like you're saying, because the downside is maybe I lose my job.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah. So, I often, dealt with facilities where there's this sort of, loss rate that exists of some percentage, and it's just accepted as part of the course of business rather than trying something that could maybe decrease or solve for that loss rate, because the risk is if it goes the other direction, they're looking for a new DOC, right? Yeah. And that's, that's always the risk. It's funny you mentioned Peters. When I had my aquaponic farm back in 2010, we were trying to find somewhere to do water samples. And we were calling all these different companies to do water samples. And they're like, well, what type of nutrients are you using in your water? And we're like, well, fish waste. It's an aquaponic system. And they're like, what do you mean? What do you want us to test for? And we're like, we want you to test for micro and macronutrients. And they're like, but what kind of nutrients are you using? We're like, fish waste. And they just couldn't get it. And then finally someone said, call Peters. And so I called them, and they were down in PA. I was in upstate New York. And I talked to the woman who answered the phone, explained what we were doing. She says, hang on a second. Next thing I know, somebody answers and he says, JR here. And it was JR. And I got talking to him, really nice guy. Immediately got what we were trying to do. And he's like, yeah, clean out a couple of Pepsi bottles, fill them up for me, put them in a Ziploc bag, ship them down here next day, and $20 a piece or whatever, and I'll get you your results. And so that's what we used. Never bought an ounce of fertilizer from them because we were running an aquaponic system, but really nice guy. And, I know he passed on and that company sold and things like that. But man, it's just a funny memory that I'll never forget. Like, cause I was at the time, didn't know who to call, right? There was no
Yeah.
help. And this guy was just willing to be super helpful. So anyway, that's my J.R. Peters story.
Yeah, that's very cool. But hey, my granddad, actually, the only non-organic fertilizer that I can remember him using over the years was Peters. And it was very rare. I think he had a box or bag of that stuff that honestly is probably still sitting there. It's been probably 50 years old. But I think those guys came from a generation where I know, like, my family history goes back generations with farming. And we'll go back to the Florida Panhandle. I grew up as a kid listening to stories from my grandparents about, my grandparents literally picked cotton when they were children. They would get out of school early. And in high school, we went on field trips in Alabama to the cotton fields to, see how the mechanization of the process took place for harvesting cotton and the cotton gins and all that stuff, because it was such a part of the culture and the community. And so but everybody kind of had a general understanding of all of the different cultivation methods that were available. And we've somehow kind of lost that over the years a little bit. Like JR and his generation, those guys knew a little bit about everything, and sometimes a whole lot about a lot of things. And so we've kind of lost, I think, over the years, just that general knowledge that existed for, like you talked to all these different labs that really didn't understand what aquaponics was even about. But kind of he came from that old school world where he knows he might not be doing it, but at least he knew enough to know what you were talking about and was able to help you out. I run into fewer and fewer of those people every year.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's a dying breed for sure. So with that experience of the different methodologies that you've seen and then, over time, and, I definitely want to get into this part of your story, but, over time you transition into more focus on cannabis cultivation and have done that at different levels, different scale. But if you're setting up a grow today, what does it look like? Is it indoor? Is it outdoor? Is it a greenhouse? Is there a specific geography? What kind of like fertility? What's your methodology? Like, given all that experience of different styles, what would you do today? Like, if it's your own dime, what are you looking to do?
Right. So, outside of designing facilities, because I still do a lot of that, design build facilities for clients. But if it's mine, if this is my, facility with my money, my reputation and success on the line here, I'm going mixed light greenhouse, living soil with a probably an aquaponics system that's supplemented as needed with top dressing.
Okay.
I think you brought up aquaponics a moment ago. One of the very first facilities that I ever designed for a cannabis cultivation operation was an aquaponics grow.
Really?
Where was that? It was in Nevada.
Okay.
And just outside Carson City in a little town called Mound House, Nevada. It was a kind of futuristic design. Really, it was this Chinese lean-to where the actual greenhouse was set down inside of the earth about 4 feet. And then the walls of the greenhouse came up. There was a much taller back wall, and it had a pretty cool greenhouse cover. It's called F-Clean, which they use a lot in more traditional like architecture for lightweight elemental places where they need a lot of light transparency, but they also need some material that's going to last for a very long time. It's a fluorocarbon material, very unique. It's self-healing, so if it gets a hole knocked into it, you can take a heat gun and heat it up, and it will just kind of melt itself back together. It's really cool stuff. But it has, like, really phenomenal properties. It's expensive to do. I don't know that it is. If it's my own greenhouse, I'm probably going glass. If I can afford it. If not, polycarbonate. But I think the cost of cannabis today and what we're seeing across all the markets, whether it's California, Michigan, New York, outside of right now, probably Connecticut still, I think the highest, but most of the markets we've seen a lot of price compression. When I consult with folks, I see labor and energy costs as the two greatest barriers to success. And then obviously taxes and things like that. But the two top line items almost always on everybody's P&L is labor and energy. And utilizing mixed light greenhouses, you can grow year round and you get to access the largest energy source that we have is the sun. And in my opinion, you can produce indoor quality flower inside of a mixed light greenhouse. It takes a lot of work to control the environment, but it is doable.
Yeah. And is there, mixed light, like a greenhouse does really great in certain environments. Like you say, like in other environments, like the Northeast, that you mentioned, New York, I managed some greenhouses up there for a while. They were a bear. There were pocket seasons where they were just gorgeous and fun and awesome. And then there were, the dead of summer was just brutal. The dead of winter was brutal. So, is there, in a perfect world where we're not restricted by state, where would you be geographically?
Tennessee.
Tennessee. Okay.
Southern Kentucky, Tennessee, I think, or, that's a tough question. I've grown in most areas of the country. I've grown in the Northeast, in the Southeast, the Southwest, the Midwest, Oregon, California, and I was in NorCal for a while in Mendocino County, in Medford, Oregon for a bit. I was in Colorado. Colorado is a tough climate to grow in outside, especially if you're down in Southwest, like around Durango. It's just so dry. There's no humidity. Water resources are an issue, but I think the Southeast, I would pick the Southeast and try to go a little bit north of like where I grew up because it does get so hot and humid, but I don't want to be so far north that we have the brutal winter. The Southeast has a rainy summer and a dry fall, and that's perfect for cannabis. Right? If you're in NorCal, you've got a really dry summer, or if you're in Southern Oregon in the Emerald Triangle, really dry summer. Then come October 1st, it starts to rain and it just doesn't stop, which can make the harvest season really challenging. Especially now, if you're indoor greenhouse, you can kind of schedule harvest. If you're mixed light, you can control your harvest schedules to kind of work around that a little bit. But yeah, I think Tennessee, North Chattanooga, Nashville, Knoxville, that area works. That would work well.
All right, cool.
Yeah. Virginia, maybe parts of Virginia.
Yeah. So how did you end up gravitating towards cannabis cultivation? What led you down the path?
Well, I had been exposed to cannabis cultivation most of my life. Growing up, I started growing in the late 90s when I was a teenager. Cannabis seeds were very difficult to obtain during this time period. And so I started breeding my own plants because just really out of necessity at the time, and started to see some like really interesting things taking place. Meanwhile, I'm, finishing high school and going to college. I started out as a business major, and doing all my business classes and accounting and all this stuff and marketing. And I had to take a biology elective for my core curriculum class. And the professor was also the university's kind of plant physiologist. And I ended up like that intro to biology course was kind of mostly focused on plant stuff, really. And so I'm like growing cannabis and I'm talking about plants at the university. And we got into a section on plant genetics. And I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. Now, keep in mind, this is early 2000s, long before cannabis, became legal. Like at this time, Prop 215 still in play, but this is during the Bush years where, it was growing was risky, especially in a place like Alabama. It was a very risky thing to do. But it wasn't just, I wasn't just growing cannabis. I was still living on my family farm and growing mums and portulaca, and we were growing hibiscus. We had all kinds of plants. We're doing our vegetable. My granddad and I, we used to breed tomato plants and okra, and so I'm involved in just all different kinds of agriculture and horticulture. And then in around 2012 or 11 or 12, I got approached by a friend that had moved to Colorado, and he said, hey, we're building a medical facility out here. And I spent a lot of time doing construction growing up as well. And I'd taken some drafting and design courses in high school. I actually worked as a draftsman for a while, excuse me, while I was in college. And so I knew how to read blueprints. I knew about plant physiology and plant growth, and it just was a good fit. So I helped them design and build that facility. And then just word of mouth, next thing I know, I've got, hey, could you help us build ours? Hey, can you help us do this and do that? And before I knew it, by 2013, 14, it turned into a full-time job.
Well, that's an incredible story, man. I mean, all the stars align. A lot of like the experience, right? To just perfect up. So was that primarily here? And so I'm in Colorado. Was that primarily here in Colorado?
It was, yeah. So from 2000 and 11, 12 up till I moved to Nevada in 2015 to do work out there. I was pretty much in Colorado there for a while. I was flying back and forth like every weekend. I'd drive over to the Atlanta airport and catch a ride to Denver and be in Denver for a week or two, and then fly back and work at home or go to school or whatever, and then fly back. And so, it was pretty crazy. The early days of the Colorado medical, and even after 2014, with the early days of the recreational scene, it was truly remarkable. It was a lot of fun to be a part of that kind of time frame.
Yeah, exciting. Yeah, I can see. Yeah, it was probably very exciting. I wasn't out here during that period of time, but I can imagine.
Yeah. Well, Colorado, Denver was at that time. We had the recession, and so like real estate was you could just pick up an industrial commercial facility for nothing, and I think cannabis really helped revitalize Denver for sure, and Colorado just as a whole during that period, because it was a tough economic situation going on in Denver at that time.
Yeah. No, I've heard. I mean, I've gotten to know some people. I've lived out here now for about 8 years, and I've gotten to know people that owned properties at that time and sold during that period, and talk about the same thing, right? The revitalization that created, and then just living here, you see what an important part of the economy the cannabis industry is, and really how vital it is, not just to people who work in cultivation or work in dispensaries, or just the tax money that flows through those entities as a result, but then just when you go down where there's an area with a lot of grows, right? The sort of Green Mile area, where in Denver they kind of allowed that industrial build out of cultivation, and like all the food trucks that are down there, at lunchtime.
Yeah.
I mean, just that, right? And the gas stations that are down there now, and all the things that survive, all the other businesses that survive and thrive because of employment that our industry creates, and it's true here, it's true everywhere we operate. So you're building the grows back in those days, and that was right about the time of 2010, 2013 was when I first took a stab at doing like a commercial facility, taking basement technology and understanding of how to do things in residential and things like that, and trying to put it in a warehouse. I made a lot of mistakes. I'm just curious what lessons learned and how when you look at a grow from 2013, 14 to today, and I'm sure back then in Denver here, you're working on all indoor, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so if you take that to an indoor today, what are the big differences? What are the things you learn? What are the things you look for? How do you operate or how do you design differently today?
Yeah. Because what you described it pretty well, taking the kind of basement technology that we were working with, because that's where we all were. Anybody that was growing cannabis during those days, we were either growing outdoors up on a mountain somewhere in a patch, or we were in a basement or attic or spare bedroom. But the technology was pretty much all the same. There was little to no automation. There was no environmental control. There were no crop steering programs there. I mean, I remember borrowing, my cousin's best friend's mom's car to drive to Worms Way to go get goods, because you couldn't even, if you bought anything that resembled what might be something utilized in a cannabis facility, you could end up in jail. And so going to Colorado during those days and the early grows that we built, we did the best that we could with what we had, and it was all HPS and metal halide for veg, and we were having to custom build our own tables because they're really, yes, there were tables that were made for horticulture, but at the time trying to adapt some of that stuff to fit in the environment that we were working in. Most of that stuff wasn't made for indoor cultivation. It was made for greenhouses. And so, if you were working inside of a building that had wooden floors at the time, you're like, man, we can't have water running all. So it was the difference. One of the things I actually had this conversation the other day with a good friend. We were talking about how the cannabis industry has pushed technology forward for just horticulture and agriculture in general. The advancements in irrigation technologies and environmental, just controlled environment ag in general, the advancements in LED lighting technology. I go and visit other controlled environment ag facilities that are not cannabis, and I see cannabis related or cannabis tangent technologies in those facilities. And that's pretty cool to know that, hey, it was the cannabis industry and its evolution that we've seen over the past, say, 15 years that is now seeping into those other industries, where before it were those industries seeping into cannabis. And to me, that's really unique. But just to go back to your question about going into a design or into a facility, it's so much different now, where we're using technologies that allow us to more accurately measure every aspect of the cultivation process, whether it's airspeed, wind speed from fans, gas-powered reheat on dehumidification and energy efficiencies for the grow room, lighting technology with side lighting and under canopy lighting to improve lighting efficiency, and how we get photons to the plants to drive photosynthesis, substrate sensors and how we're able to measure EC and temperature and pH and all of those things remotely. I mean, I can pull up an app on my phone now and see exactly what's going on in every room in every facility that I'm working with and not need to leave the house. I can also access camera footage and see like, oh, okay, okay, these fans are working, this is working. None of that existed, 10 years ago, really, even. So it's just a figuring, and honestly, as a design build, somebody who works in that space, it's challenging sometimes to figure out like what's the best. There's so much to choose from now with all the different technology. It's like what's the best fit for what I'm trying to do. Whereas before we were having to develop the technology at the time. Something else I think that's really changed a lot is being able to bring in Six Sigma and lean manufacturing. Before we didn't really think about those things when margins were pretty high. But now that margins are pretty tight, you really have to think about operational efficiency. So like when I'm designing a facility, I literally am like, okay, how many steps does employee X have to take to go and transplant this plant? How many steps do they have to take from when they harvest that to get to the grow room? How many feet of wire do I need from the electrical room? So every aspect of the design process goes through an efficiency, lean manufacturing, 5S, like a level of optimization that just wasn't even really a concept for us, because it was just, hey, we're going to grow and we're going to make money. That's not the case anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. No, certainly not. Right. I mean, it's like you said, the margins are a lot tighter. When you're looking at, the choices, you mentioned it, right? There's always trade-offs. For me, it's environmental, and then photons, and then water. And that's how I rank, right? And it gives me a framework to make choices from. And the limiting factor is always CapEx, right? It's cash, to make those choices. So how do you look at it? Like, how do you make those trade-offs? And, in particular, I'll give you an example, right? Looking at a new build and the growers want under canopy, right? And they want 1200 ppfd on the top. So that dictates your top light wattage. To add the under canopy adds like another 25% of heat and transpiration, and therefore HVAC load. The HVAC numbers go through the roof. Right. And I'm like, guys, it's not in the budget, right? Like, it's not in this budget to do that. And so, that's trade-off, right? And so how do you look at those trade-offs?
Usually where I start is with the, what is the end goal of the operation? Like, what are we here for? What are we doing? What is our purpose in this market? Are we striving to be a large scale cultivation operation that is providing an affordable, middle tier product that has good numbers, good genetics, good quality, but maybe isn't striving for that top shelf, top tier, most expensive spot? So a lot of that will dictate some of the trade-off. But there's definitely a trade-off to be made no matter what area of the marketplace that you're trying to occupy. I think you're spot on with environment first, because if you can't control your environment, you can't control anything.
Yeah.
If you can't, and HVAC is by and large one of the, to me, as a grower, as a design build, it is such a critical component of success for any operation. If you mess up on those load calculations and undersize your HVAC, it's going to cost you twice as much on the back end to make to fix it. And then you've got a situation where you've got, this really expensive HVAC system you built, and now you're trying to add on maybe some mini splits and extra dehues, and now you're cluttering up your grow room, which ideally try to keep kind of pristine, from the design phase. Like when I design a grow, I don't want a bunch of extra stuff in the room that I have to work around. I'm trying to keep all of that stuff out of the grow room. But for me, I very much, environmental control is that's the number one factor in starting, that's the foundation of everything from there. And then lighting photons, like you said, that drives and is directly correlated and tied to your HVAC. The more wattage you have pushing photons, the more tonnage you're going to need for your HVAC design. I think it's really, I think we've seen a lot of advancement in HVAC over the years, especially with, hot gas reheat or just reheat in general, being able to eliminate the loads created by putting dehumidifiers in the grow room. It's a necessary evil because you're dehumidifying the air, but you're also adding a substantial amount of BTUs of heat into the room with like a crust or an andin, hanging on the wall. Incorporating that into the overall design, I think, is important. But it's tough to get to that point where it's like, okay, we can hit maximum yield, maximum output of this, and then it's just kind of going backwards. Like, how do we do that to hit the overall goals of the business? If you're shooting for top quality product and top tier pricing, there's fewer concessions that you can make. Like, you're going to have to spend the money to be able to dial in your environment, dial in your irrigation, dial in maybe you're going to have that under canopy lighting, and maybe you're going to have the side lighting and things. I think there's a lot of discussion about PPFD and what level of photosynthetic active radiation is needed to achieve maximum output. I was always of the opinion that the more light, the better, for a long time. And then I was exposed to a situation where I had a facility that was limited in the amount of power that was available. So the max PPFD we could get was 600 top canopy. And I'm like, okay, I mean, that's it. Like, we couldn't do more. Like, we couldn't. And so we designed everything around that, and we adjusted numbers, accordingly. And we thought that we set appropriate goals. And then, we started playing around with irrigation schedules and drawbacks, and genetics was a big factor in this as well. We found genetics that worked well in a little bit lower light environment. And lo and behold, before long, we're just blasting past our initial expectations of what we thought the maximum output could be, and hitting numbers that were pretty close to what I thought they would be if we had 2 or 3 times that amount of light.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so to me, it was humbling because I thought, okay, there's just no way we're going to do, these big numbers. But it brought me back to how important genetics are. And that just because one of the things I think that makes a great grower is that they can adapt to the environment that they're in and still produce. Right? Like, the guys that I know that are top tier cultivators, they can take a facility with 400, 500 PPFD and still crank out 75, 80 grams a square foot of Class A top tier shelf flower,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just,
you're 100% right. No, I saw it very, very early on as commercial and states were coming online, and I was doing a lot of work also in Canada at the time with LPs that were wildly funded and building, insanely expensive facilities. And yeah, at the time I was working with a grower up in Canada, $600 a square foot brand new facility. Then, the weed was mid at best. And I'm working with a guy down in Rhode Island that's growing in an old Napa auto parts building. And it's all wood everywhere. And it's like an A-frame upstairs. And it's just this crazy, really not ideal building. The lights sucked, all that stuff. Like, I think at one point when I first met him, he still had like Batwing reflector lights,
Oh, yeah.
a single tube. And he was just banging. It's gorgeous flower, right? And it was, so much of it is attention,
Yeah.
right? The attention given and the care, right? The level of care as well. So I think you're absolutely right. It's the, what do they say? It's the jockey, not the horse, or
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I very much think that, give a great grower any environment and they'll figure out how to grow good weed there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the genetics a couple of times, right? And genetics really fascinate me because not only the nuances of applying the right genetic to your environment, to your growth style, to these environmental factors that we have, and choosing strains and specific genetics for those. But then there's also this drive of the market, right? The market and your head of sales, whether you're an SSO or an MSO or whatever, your head of sales, your salespeople are coming to you saying, this is what the market wants. And so much of that right now is driven by THC percentage, which we can, discuss that. I mean, till the cows come home, how crazy it is and how it doesn't make sense and this, that, and everything. And it doesn't, right? But it's not great, but it is what it is. It's what the market wants. And so we're driving towards that as okay to fill the market need. But so there's that piece of genetics, right? But then also what's interesting to me is the different ways in which we can acquire genetics, handle, do breeding, clean them up, right? I'm really fascinated by tissue culture. I'm really fascinated by seed production in cannabis. I was years and years ago talking to a very, very smart, he was a PhD in plant science that worked for a grower that I was working with. And he told me probably 10 years ago, he was like, everything will go to seed production. That's his prediction. Everything's going to go to seed production eventually. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, because that's how large scale hort is done. It's all seed production for plants that can be done that way. And so, stabilized seed. And then even today we see where, speaking of Canadian LPs, Organogram has gone to seed. Everything is seed with them. Their whole, my understanding is their whole facility, big ass facility up there on the eastern shores of Canada, is all seed. It's a huge facility. Huge advantages there if it can be done, if you can get the stability, right, of that. And so when you're working genetics, what are you focused on? Are you doing tissue culture? Are you doing seed breeding? Are you pollen chucking? Like what are you doing to do genetics?
For myself, like for Yellowhammer?
Yeah, for Yellowhammer.
Yeah. So I've been breeding, like I said, I started breeding out of a necessity just to have seed to grow. Back when the only place really to get seeds were from, the back of Cannabis Culture magazine through Mark Emery, and maybe they made it, maybe they didn't. But it was also very risky because you didn't know if they were going to get intercepted, and if they did get intercepted, maybe they get shipped to your door and then you get found out some way. Like ordering seeds back in the day was a legitimate security risk. So for me, it started out as necessity and grew into a lifelong, really scientific. It's what led me to get a master's degree focused on genetics. So when I went to, like I said, when I started college, I was in business, and then switched to biology and minored in chemistry. And and then went back, got my double major in chemistry and minored in mathematics. Then went to grad school and studied genetics there, population genetics specifically. So around that 2012 mark, 2013 mark, I'd still been breeding, and we were doing seed sales and stuff, mainly on the forums and whatnot, and just local trades and stuff. And it really wasn't, it was just a hobby at the time. I mean, I was still interested in it, but there was no marketplace really like there exists today for seeds. So, but 2012-13 came around, and then the 2014, the early medical markets, Colorado, California, Oregon stuff, those provided some marketplace, especially when, I'm helping design build a facility, and they're like, oh, what do we do about genetics? And I'm like, hey, we got tons of seeds, we got you. That was a big relief for a lot of the early owner builders, that they didn't have to worry about genetics, or we could get genetics. Now, that's still a thing, but things have changed a lot in the past 10 years with cannabis genetics. I mean, it's really remarkable, to be honest with you. First off, the global cannabis genetics trade, just the seed trade in and of itself, is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. It's huge, especially with European markets allowing home grow as kind of their first step into legalization. A lot of states in the U.S. are allowing home grow as well. Some are restricting it, but there's still a lot of growers in the U.S. For me, my breeding projects are multifaceted. I started out breeding type 1 THC dominant cannabis. 2014, with the passage of the pilot program for CBD and industrial hemp in Colorado, I quickly realized there's a need for CBD genetics. So I started working on developing new CBD cultivars at the same time, which then got me going, hey, let's combine the two. And next thing I know, I've got solid type 1, type 2, and type 3 genetic breeding programs that are going on. And those continued over the time span from 2014 to around 2020. I probably created and sold around 25, maybe 40 million cannabis seeds. A lot of those.
That's a big number.
Yeah.
That's a big number. Before you go on, I got to ask you this, because I see, people talking about type 1, type 2, type 3. These things. What does that mean?
So type 1, we're talking specifically about chemotype. And when we're talking about chemotype, we're talking about the dominant cannabinoid that the plant produces. So type 1 chemotypes are THC dominant plants. Type 3 are CBD dominant plants. And then type 2 usually is a combination where you see like a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 or some almost equal ratio of THC CBD. There are multiple others. There's type 4 plants, which are CBG dominant plants. Type 5, which have no cannabinoids at all, and kind of keeps going, right? Like we're starting to see CBC dominant plants that pop up. We've got THCV dominance, CBDV dominance. So before it was really just THC dominant plants, and that's what most everybody had. If you go and you look at the natural history of cannabis, and let's say you were to take a trip to the jungles of Thailand, and you were to be hiking through, and then all of a sudden you come upon a natural population of cannabis plants. You're going to find that population, more times than not, exists naturally as a mixture of type 1, type 2, and type 3 dominance. The kind of natural state of cannabis is to have a varied type of cannabinoids for whatever evolutionary reason, and a lot of the population, about half, a little more, will exist as a type 2 dominant plant. which I find really interesting because if you go back and look at some of the literature for like the 70s, 80s, and 90s during the years of drug bust for the DEA, when they would publish findings from different studies because they wanted to be able to use chemotype as a way to track cannabis across the globe. And so they started studying different hash that was, taken from different areas, that maybe it was from Turkey or Morocco or Afghanistan or Pakistan. They started looking at the different chemical signatures, and there ended up being quite a bit of CBD in a lot of the old school hash that was consumed.
Okay.
And so where we're at now with like talking about the THC and the marketing and where markets are driven, I remember when 20% was the strongest strain on the planet, and that hasn't been that long ago. 2014, Bruce Banner broke 30% as cannabis' strongest strain. How far can we go? As a scientist that knows a lot about cannabis and its physiology, I struggle to see us moving beyond 35% as a consistent kind of cap for the maximum amount of THC that a plant can hold.
Sure.
Just because of the actual anatomy of the trichome, the anatomy of the plant. I mean, you can only pack so many trichomes on a leaf, and that's at the end of the day the number of trichomes and the metabolites inside the head are what determine the potency. And so, and there are 3 or 4 different types of trichomes on the plant, but the capitate stalk are the ones that we're most interested in, the ones that that look like a mushroom. Interestingly, CBD and type 2 or type 3 dominant plants are the same. But going back to what I use tissue culture in my breeding work. One, when you have tons of different varieties that you need to maintain, trying to keep a mother room with 200-300 different varieties at a time, it's impossible. It just, the cost is, and the labor, it is an enormous amount of work to try to keep that many mother plants alive. With tissue culture, I can store 80 of those in the refrigerator or reduce them down into a couple of small containers. And, I'm planning out breeding projects that are 24 months, 36 months out, right? So I know when I need to pull those out, get them, rooted and go through the process. Also, I have a lot of genetics that I collected in the late 90s and early 2000s that are incredibly rare now, that have to have embryonic rescue, or else the germination rates, these are 25, 30-year-old seeds. Most of them have just, if I were to put them in a typical tray to try to germinate them, or even in like the old, napkin method in a Ziploc bag, right? I might get, if I'm lucky, 10% germination out of those. And I may only have 10 seeds. So getting 1 out of 10 is, that's not doing me any good, or anybody else, to bring some of these genetics back. So tissue culture.
What is embryonic rescue?
So long as the cannabis seed is still a viable seed, meaning that the shell is intact, the pericarp is intact, and the seed itself hasn't dried out. Usually what happens with a cannabis seed that has a low germination rate is there's an enzyme in there that over time starts to break down. That's inside the actual plant. It's called alpha amylase. And alpha amylase helps to start the germination process for the plant, along with beta amylase as well. But using embryonic rescue, what we do is we crack the seed open, and we take that very fragile taproot and cotyledon, and we transfer that over an aseptic technique into a growth medium that is full of all of the enzymes that are naturally found inside of the seed that have just over time gone through break. The enzymes are very fragile, and so they break down over time. The genetic tissue is still viable. The genetic tissue is still there. We just need to be able to supplement those enzymes to kickstart that process. So that essentially is all embryonic rescue is.
Wow. I love how you say it casually. That's all it is. Like,
Yeah, I mean,
that's some pretty high level stuff.
yeah, but it's used pretty frequently in traditional agriculture. I say pretty, yeah, it's used pretty frequently because sometimes in traditional agriculture they'll make hybrids that they want to explore between two different varieties that the germplasm might not germinate very well, and so they're using embryonic rescue type SOP to get those genetics growing so that they can use them to further research the genetic or to breed with them.
Okay.
Right. It might not be something that they're going to use for large scale production, but if they can get enough of those plants growing through embryonic rescue, it's enough to continue on the breeding process to explore whatever genes. And so cannabis is kind of the same way. The cut Mac 1 is historically and just notoriously known for producing seeds that are either mostly sterile or seeds, they just don't make seeds very well at all. And I've found over the years, I get a much greater success on Mac 1 crosses and just don't even try to germinate them, just put them in the embryonic program and send them through. Then I can generate enough plants to use for breeding projects that I need. Mm-hmm. But we're in a situation now where this is all about to change. Like if you're in America and you are doing all the work that I'm doing, work that like Jeremy Clark at Davis Farms is doing, and all of the other breeders out here who are breeding. It's amazing. There's more new varieties coming out now that I can even keep up with. Come November, this could end for all of us
because of the change in the hemp regs. Yeah.
It definitely is going to put an end to our marketplace for most of us, unless you are operating in a state that allows home cultivation. You can kind of conduct business within that state, but there's no interstate commerce. There's no more internet sales. I was talking with some folks that are experts in, the APHIS and USDA import-export with phytosanitary certs and all that. It's going to be very challenging moving forward to even get seeds out of the country through a regulated program because of this legislation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I can tell you from breeding millions and millions of cannabis genetics and creating seeds for type 3 CBD farmers, industrial hemp farmers, mm-hmm. The 0.3 threshold that they have arbitrarily created for this, what is hemp and what isn't, it's almost genetically impossible to guarantee that a cultivar can't cross that threshold. Mm. There's so many environmental factors and other factors that go into that determination that it's a challenge. Can I guarantee you it's not going to go over 1%? Absolutely. Yes, I can guarantee you that my type 3 genetics will not go over 1% THC, total THC. That's a combination of Delta 9 and THCA, right? But can I guarantee you they're not going to go over 0.3? I don't think there's any type 3 breeder out there that can guarantee it.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So where does that leave? How do people position for this potential change? I mean, right now the change is on the books, right? I mean, it's right now unless there's some intervention. So it's you can assume, or I would assume as a business person, okay, this is what's happening. How do people prepare for that?
I think if you're a cannabis business operator in any of the states that have medical or adult use cannabis, and you do not have a vault of genetics in seed form stored, you should be looking to do so right now. You need to be looking to expand your collection of genetics to get them into your facility and into your inventory is through whatever mechanism exists. Every state's different. Like Illinois has a very specific process. Ohio, Massachusetts, New York, they all are a little bit different. Usually you contact Metric, they open up a window, you bring them in, you put them in. Colorado, is different too. Try to get as many seed form genetics as you can get from a reputable source, reputable breeders, and then some states allow breeding programs. Like here in Massachusetts, we can breed on site, so we can implement breeding programs to create new genetics from things that are in-house. There's also a marketplace to sell genetics through dispensaries via seed or clone, so long as home grow exists, right? And so there's marketplace there, but not like, what am I supposed to do as a seed company? Am I supposed to essentially establish my business in every individual marketplace to try? But then some states require you to have a license and to be able to sell to other cannabis businesses, to do B2B sales. I don't think they really thought this through very well.
Yeah, I would have to agree. As tends to happen, and unfortunately, the way we're still set up, and with laws being what they still are, that continues to be the case, right? It's not real well thought out, and there's constantly these curveballs being thrown that we have to adapt to and kind of meet the market where it is. So,
well, talking about the market, I mean, genetics play such an important part in the overall success of the business.
Mm-hmm.
One, genetics are what allow you as a business to differentiate yourself from your competitors. Your genetics, let's say, I'll give you an example. When I first moved to Massachusetts from Southern Oregon, I had a bunch of cuts from Southern Oregon that I brought out to Massachusetts, and we're similar, latitude and climate's kind of similar. I thought, man, these cuts are going to just crush, and no, they didn't. The cuts that I thought were just going to absolutely do well out here just fell flat on their face, and so I had to spend several years breeding genetics in Massachusetts for outdoors so that they would perform well. But if you've spent years acquiring and cultivating genetics that work very well for your facility, and you have, let's say a library of 30 strains that you cycle in and out throughout the years, you're not going to be able to add to that. You're going to be stuck with what you have, basically, and it's such an important part of the success of your business that you really have to think ahead. Like you said, the market is always changing, whether it's THC percentage. Do we want purple flower? Do we want perps? Do we need candy gas? Do we need Zol? What are people wanting? That's constantly, and cultivation it's not like, okay, well, we got this marketing research, and we're going to take the data from that marketing research. We're going to work our way back to cultivation. Well, guess what? It's not like a harvest happens in a week. From that time that market research gets gathered, you process, analyze the data, make some decisions, and then you make a choice. Now you're looking at 13, 16 weeks out before your first harvest.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
it's a long lead time. It's a long cycle, right? Yeah. To have a fickle market that's constantly shifting around on us. Yeah, it adds a wrinkle for sure. I think though that like what you're saying about the genetics and protecting with this shift that's probably happening, we don't know, but is really important, right? I mean, I think if there's nothing else that people take away from our conversation today, I think that nugget is super valuable. So I'm glad that you're sharing that with everybody. You know,
I do think cultivators. You're talking about going back. You brought up moving from clones to seed production. I want to quickly touch on that. I do see that as a viable method of production. And I mean, I know for a fact that it's possible to get there because I've done it. I've done it in the field outdoors. I've done it in greenhouse. I've done it indoors where we've germinated seed and ran an entire run of one genetic, a large population that has been stabilized. It is possible. A lot of I think there's going to be a lot of resistance to it just because people have seen the type of variety that it can exist in seeds. Germination rates are going to be a determining factor as well, but it is possible to do that, and I think we will, pending this legislation and how things go with seeds and how they move about through the marketplace. I think we'll continue to see more and more businesses move in that direction if they're able.
yeah, yeah, awesome. Well, listen, Josh, we're gonna have to have you back on because you and I could talk for hours and hours, I think, on a variety of
Absolutely.
different stuff. I'm so glad we finally got to connect. As we kind of wrap up, I'm just curious if people want to get in touch with you, right, for a variety of reasons. There's a variety of reasons why they may want to do that. How do people go about getting a hold of you?
So I'm in the process actually of rebuilding our website to try to address some of these new legislative changes. So usually we're at yellowhammergenetics.com. I'm going to throw up a contact board there. So or LinkedIn's a great way. I've got a Yellowhammer page on LinkedIn, or just search me up through Yellowhammer Genetics or Joshua Turner on LinkedIn, or just Josh at yellowhammergenetics.com. It's my email address. Easiest way to get a hold of me, probably.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for your time. Like I said, we're gonna have to have you back on. There's a ton more we can talk about. But I really enjoyed our conversation. I learned a ton today from you, and yeah, I look forward to connecting again in the near future.
Well, thanks for having me so much, Mark. I appreciate it, and looking forward to our next discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Mark.